tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Imagine that one of the most powerful and resilient supply chains in the world, the chain that provides almost everything necessary for life in the United States, suddenly begins to collapse before your eyes. No, it's not a virus or a strike. It's not a natural disaster, but the result of harsh trade policies that are literally paralyzing the country's ports, warehouses, and transportation networks. At the Port of Los Angeles, the largest port in the United States and a gateway for international trade, cargo volumes have fallen by more than a third. 1 in 4 ships that were supposed to arrive simply disappears from the schedule. Containers are empty, truck drivers are going home, and warehouses are cutting shifts. This is not just a slowdown, it is a complete standstill that could cost the US economy more than $50 billion in a single quarter.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
What caused this collapse? It all started with unexpected and drastic decisions that came from Washington. President Donald Trump reimposed harsh tariffs on goods from China, Mexico, Canada, and Europe. The 25% price increase affected literally everything, from steel and aluminum to electronics and food products. Some Chinese goods more than doubled in price, with tariffs reaching 145%. Previous rules that allowed cheap foreign goods to enter the US market unhindered have been abolished. And now even small parcels, which are key to large online retailers, are subject to taxes. This policy instantly disrupted the usual rhythm of trade.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, you know, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
Companies tried to adapt by stocking warehouses in advance and increasing the first deliveries of the year. But now stocks are running out and new orders are declining. Importers do not want to pay exorbitant tariffs, and suppliers in other countries are cutting back or even stopping deliveries. Ports that used to operate non-stop are now empty. In Alabama, for example, Chinese shipments fell by 40% in the spring. Railroad companies are transporting less and less cargo, not because there are no workers, but because there is simply no cargo. And this is only the beginning. Ahead lie empty store shelves, shortages of goods, rising prices, and job cuts. Car factories are already halting assembly lines due to a lack of parts, and major retailers are warning of rising food prices. Everything from electronics to school supplies has been caught up in this chaos. Even warehouse rentals have become a problem. They are filled to capacity, prices have quadrupled, and new facilities have a 6-month waiting list.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
And if you think this is just an economic issue, think again. 12 US states have already filed lawsuits against the president's administration, arguing that imposing tariffs without congressional approval is unconstitutional. This lawsuit could change the rules of the game, not only in this trade war, but in American economic policy as a whole. This is not just a story about tariffs and supplies, it is a story about how political decisions can lead to a distant economic crisis that will be felt by every American. Empty shelves, rising prices, factory shutdowns and job losses are no longer predictions, but a reality that is unfolding right now. Follow us to understand what is happening at the heart of the global economy and what decisions could save the day or make things even worse. A time of great change is upon us, and you need to be ready for it. In recent months, the US has faced an unprecedented crisis in its supply chain, which began to develop gradually, almost imperceptibly, but reached critical proportions by mid-2025. Initially, there were no sudden shocks, no sudden explosions in warehouses, acute supply disruptions, or mass worker strikes. Everything happened smoothly and unnoticed by most people. Some deliveries were cancelled, ship voyages disappeared from schedules, some goods were delayed at customs, and stores began to notice the first gaps in their inventories. Although these changes seemed insignificant and temporary at first, their effect was cumulative. When analysts and experts began to warn of serious problems in the supply chain, many were already unprepared for the scale of the looming crisis.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
The supply chain, long considered one of the most resilient and innovative in the world, is now on the verge of complete collapse. The system, built on the principle of just-in-time, where goods and components are delivered almost as needed, does not have large inventories, which means that any delay immediately affects production and retail trade. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that the cause of the disruption is not related to external force majeure circumstances. There is no pandemic, natural disaster, or large-scale strikes. It is politics, economic decisions, and countermeasures that are causing delays at all stages of delivery. On May 26, 2025, the largest port in the US, Los Angeles, which handles over 40% of the country's total maritime cargo, announced a sharp drop in incoming cargo volumes of more than 35%. Terminals designed to receive dozens of containers daily are now receiving only a small fraction of their usual volume. One port executive stated outright that 1 in 4 scheduled sailings have been cancelled or rerouted, leading to huge empty containers and reduced shifts at warehouses and transport companies. This situation cannot be called a slowdown. It is a real freeze that threatens to disrupt the entire supply chain.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
The situation is largely a consequence of the trade policy adopted in Washington. Earlier in 2025, President Donald Trump announced the introduction of broad tariffs on imports from China, Mexico, Canada, and the European Union. Virtually all major categories of goods, metal, electronics, textiles, agricultural products rose in price by 25% or more. In some cases, especially for Chinese goods, tariffs reached 145%. At the same time, previous rules that allowed some low-priced goods to enter the US market without duties were abolished. Now even parcels worth less than $800, which are actively used by large online stores, are subject to taxes. This decision disrupted the usual supply chain and increased import costs, forcing businesses to rethink their strategies. At first, companies tried to adapt to the new conditions. Importers and logistics operators sought to increase deliveries in the first months of the year to build up stocks and minimize the risk of disruptions. Warehouses were overflowing, and containers arrived in large quantities. However, this effect proved to be temporary. Stocks began to dwindle and new orders started to decline as many importers and manufacturers refused to pay the increased tariffs and foreign suppliers limited or suspended deliveries altogether. This reaction caused a cascade effect. A decrease in cargo volumes at ports leads to a reduction in rail and road transport, which in turn affects warehouse operations and retail sales.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
The Port of Los Angeles is a clear example of how quickly the situation is deteriorating. Normally, more than a dozen container ships dock there every day, but last week that number fell to 6. More than 20 voyages have been cancelled this month, resulting in the cancellation of nearly 300,000 containers of goods. The picture is similar in other ports. For example, the Port of Mobile in Alabama has seen a 40% drop in Chinese shipments in the spring. Railroad companies Union Pacific and Beans, which provide intermodal transportation, also report a decline in freight traffic not because of strikes or technical problems, but because shipments are simply not reaching them.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
This chain of interconnected events is dangerous because the entire supply system operates on a continuous flow principle. Ports supply trucks, which deliver goods to warehouses, and warehouses provide stores and businesses with the necessary resources. If there is a failure at any stage, the entire mechanism begins to break down. In this case, according to Los Angeles Port Executive Director Gene Soka, the country has only 5 to 7 weeks of full reserves left. After that, the choice of goods will become increasingly limited and store shelves will be empty. Retailers are already seeing the first signs of a looming crisis: school supplies, seasonal Halloween costumes, summer clothing. All of these items should already be arriving in stores, but orders are being delayed, cancelled, or stuck at customs due to changes in product classification and trade rules. If this situation continues, prices for goods will begin to rise, as shortages lead to higher costs. As a result, consumer activity will decline, leading to reduced spending and, consequently, a wave of layoffs. This is precisely the scenario predicted by Wall Street analysts and government experts.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Financial institutions have already raised the probability of a recession in the US to 60% in 2025. The International Monetary Fund has lowered its economic growth forecasts, and economists are modeling losses of about $50 billion in GDP directly related to trade disruptions and rising production costs. In this context, car dealers are already raising prices. For example, Ford increased the cost of some models manufactured in Mexico by up to $2,000 in early May, openly citing tariffs. General Motors expects losses of $4 to $5 billion this year, and despite efforts to cut costs, price increases are inevitable.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Companies are forced to pass on increased costs to end consumers, which is reflected in price increases for virtually all categories of goods, from food and clothing to electronics and automobiles. For example, automakers Ford and General Motors have already raised prices for their models manufactured in Mexico by several $1,000s at the beginning of the year, directly pointing to the impact of tariff policy. Retailers such as Walmart and Target are warning consumers about price increases for fresh fruits and vegetables, especially those imported from neighboring countries, including avocados, strawberries, and bananas. Analysts note that this trend will spread to other product categories, affecting the standard of living of millions of Americans. The digital sector is also under threat. Due to restrictions and new rules on customs procedures and tariffs, the delivery of electronic goods and components is being significantly delayed. This is affecting the supply of smartphones, computers, and components for the production of hardware and software. Technology companies are already signaling the need to review their production chains, which requires time and investment. Some large export and import-oriented factories have already reported a decline in production volumes and a reduction in work shifts. In addition, problems with skilled labor are growing. Reduced working hours, unstable orders, and uncertainty about the future of the industry are forcing specialists to look for other opportunities, leading to labor shortages and increased costs for recruiting and retaining staff. In some regions, there have been cases of mass layoffs, especially in logistics and manufacturing, which is further exacerbating the crisis. Against the backdrop of these economic challenges, a political struggle is also unfolding. In several states, including New York, Oregon, and Illinois, a group of attorneys general has filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration, arguing that the imposition of tariffs without congressional approval violates the U.S. Constitution. The lawsuit is based on the argument that the use of international economic emergency powers, in this case, is unjustified and leads to serious economic consequences that could have been prevented with proper legislative oversight. The federal court's consideration of this case promises to be an important precedent that could affect the executive branch's powers in the area of economic policy and the further development of the trade war. Meanwhile, tensions are growing among business communities and state politicians who are increasingly voicing their dissatisfaction and calling for a review of trade policy. Some governors and industry leaders are calling for a more balanced approach, highlighting the risks to jobs and the stability of regional economies. Behind the scenes, closed-door meetings and consultations with federal authorities are taking place to discuss measures to mitigate the impact and find compromise solutions. Taken together, these factors pose a serious challenge to the country's economy. Slowdowns in shipments, rising costs, production problems, and political difficulties are creating a complex and tense situation that requires immediate attention and action. The longer these problems persist, the deeper their impact will be on American companies, consumers, and the nation's well-being. The coming months and years will reveal whether the authorities can strike a balance between protecting their own interests and maintaining the openness and efficiency of the trade and logistics systems on which the fate of the entire economy depends. Despite all efforts to negotiate and find compromises, the trade standoff between the US and the European Union has reached a stage where a return to previous levels of cooperation seems increasingly unlikely. Experience from past conflicts with China has shown that cycles of threats and concessions can lead to temporary calm. But the situation with Europe is significantly different in terms of its intensity and geopolitical implications. Aggressive rhetoric and unilateral measures by the US, including the introduction of 50% tariffs, have been met with a strong response in Brussels, where a package of countermeasures worth over €100 billion has been prepared. This decision is not only aimed at retaliation, but also signals Europe's deep determination to defend its economic interests and not allow itself to be pressured even by such a major partner as the US. The EU's internal policy is now focused on creating its own technological and industrial independence, which only exacerbates the situation. The reaction of European leaders has been consistent and comprehensive. In addition to imposing retaliatory tariffs on thousands of US goods, ranging from aircraft worth around $13 billion to agricultural products and amusement park equipment, Brussels has decided to file an official complaint with the World Trade Organization. This international legal pressure on Washington marked a new level of conflict, reflecting not just economic differences but also rivalry for global influence and status. The European Commission has also tightened control over digital markets by introducing new regulations that affect major US tech giants such as Meta, Apple, and Alphabet. Harsh fines and new data protection requirements serve as both an economic and political tool to reduce US dominance in the critical technology and information sector. The economic consequences of these measures are already visible and are causing concern among analysts and investors. According to models by leading economists, the full implementation of 50% tariffs on European goods will reduce US GDP growth by approximately 0.6 percentage points, bringing the country's economy closer to recession. For the Eurozone, the situation is even more critical. A sharp drop in exports and increased trade barriers could cause stagnation or even a contraction in economic activity. Inflationary pressures in the US will intensify as rising costs for imported goods and components are passed on to consumers, reducing their purchasing power and slowing economic growth. Financial markets have already responded to these threats with significant volatility, reflecting the high level of uncertainty and risk to global stability. The political situation on both sides of the Atlantic is also heating up. In the US, pressure is mounting from states and businesses on the federal government to review its tariff policy. Several states have filed lawsuits against the Trump administration, arguing that imposing tariffs without congressional approval violates constitutional norms and causes irreparable harm to the economy. The outcome of these cases could shift the balance of power and limit the president's authority over trade policy. In Europe, nationalist and protectionist sentiments are growing, strengthening political support for measures against the US and stimulating the development of domestic industries and technologies as part of a strategy for economic independence. Scenarios for the development of the situation range from the possibility of resuming negotiations and reaching compromises to a complete breakdown of trade relations, which would lead to deep economic and political turbulence. The consequences will affect not only the economy, but also international security, cooperation in science and technology, and cultural exchanges. The growth of trade barriers and sanctions will create a domino effect that will affect many countries and regions, threatening global economic growth and stability. The current trade war between the US and the EU is a test for the global economy and the international system. In the coming months, the decisions taken in Washington and Brussels will determine the direction of global relations for years to come. For businesses, consumers, and ordinary citizens, the consequences could be serious, ranging from rising prices and job losses to a decline in quality of life and reduced access to goods. In this context, it is important to monitor developments, understand the motives and risks, and be prepared for the changes that this economic and political struggle will inevitably bring.